The doors of the great hall slammed open before Lila Bennett could even steady her breathing, and two guards pushed her forward so hard, she stumbled onto the cold stone floor in front of 1,000 watching eyes. She rose quickly, brushing dust from her knees, refusing to let anyone see her shake. The hall smelled of smoke and pine, and every torch on the wall bent as if the air itself feared the man sitting on the high seat above her. King Damien Ashgrove did not stand to greet her. He did not need to. His presence alone pressed down on the room like a storm before it breaks. His eyes, pale as frost, studied her the way a man studies a stranger who has wandered onto his land without permission. Around him, advisors whispered behind raised hands, already calculating what her arrival meant for the kingdom. Lila had been told only that she was chosen. No one explained what that meant until the carriage ride here, when an older woman muttered that the king was searching for a mate, and every pack in the region had sent a daughter to be judged. Lila had not volunteered. Her name had simply been written on a list, and lists, she had learned, were rarely kind to people like her. "Step forward," said the man beside the throne, his voice low and formal. He was tall, with sharp green eyes, and dark hair pulled back neatly, standing at the king's right side like a shadow trained to move only when needed. This was Callum, the king's beta, the second most powerful man in the kingdom, though far less feared than the king himself. Lila stepped forward, chin lifted, refusing to let her knees betray her fear. She had grown up healing wounds in a small pack far from politics, far from thrones, far from men who could crush her simply by raising a hand. She did not know how to bow the way the court expected. She did not know how to smile the way the other girls in the waiting hall had smiled, desperate and hopeful, hungry for a crown. She only knew that something about this entire ceremony felt wrong, like being sized up for a cage rather than a future. "Name," Damien said, his tone flat, almost bored, as though he had already asked this question 100 times today and expected the same nervous answer he always received. "Lila Bennett," she said, her voice steady despite the pounding in her chest. He studied her for a long moment, the kind of look that made the room hold its breath. Then, without warning, he stood. The entire court rose with him, a wave of movement rippling through silk and armor. He walked down the few steps from his throne, slow and deliberate, until he stood only a few feet from her. Up close, he was even more overwhelming. Broad shoulders draped in a dark cloak, a presence that seemed to swallow the space around him. "You may kneel," he said. It was not truly a request. Lila felt every eye in the hall settle on her, waiting to see if she would obey the way every other candidate had obeyed. Waiting to see her lower herself the way tradition demanded. She did not kneel. A murmur spread through the crowd, like wind through dry grass. Damien's eyes narrowed slightly, more curious than angry, as if trying to understand a puzzle no one had ever placed in front of him before. "I said kneel," he repeated, quieter this time, almost gentle, though there was steel beneath the softness. "I heard you," Lila said. "I am simply choosing not to." The silence that followed was so complete that Lila could hear her own heartbeat echoing in her ears. Somewhere near the throne, Callum shifted his weight, watching the exchange with an expression caught between disbelief and quiet interest. No candidate had ever refused a direct order from the king. Not once, not in all the years he had served beside him. Damien tilted his head, studying her as though she were a rare animal that had wandered into his territory without fear of the predators around it. "Do you understand what I am offering you?" he asked. "Position, protection for your pack, a place at my side that every woman in this hall would trade her future for." "I understand what you are offering," Lila said. "I am simply not interested in taking it." The words landed like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through every corner of the hall. Several nobles gasped audibly. One woman near the front actually laughed in disbelief before quickly covering her mouth. Damien's jaw tightened, the first crack of true emotion breaking through his controlled exterior. "You refuse the Alpha King," he said, his voice lower now, almost dangerous. "I refuse to be chosen like a piece of property," Lila answered. "If that is refusing you, then yes, I refuse." For a long moment, nothing happened. The king simply stared at her, searching her face for a lie, for fear, for the performance he assumed all clever women eventually attempted, in order to seem more desirable. He found none of it, only steady, quiet defiance. Then, without another word, he turned, and walked back to his throne, sitting down, as though nothing unusual had occurred at all. "Take her to the guest quarters," he said to the guards. "We are not finished." Lila was led away through a side corridor, her legs finally trembling now that no one could see her face. Behind her, whispers followed like smoke, carrying her name through the halls of the castle far faster than she could walk. The guest quarters were far grander than anything Lila had ever known, a wide room with high windows, overlooking a moonlit forest, a bed piled with furs, and a fire already burning in the hearth. She barely noticed the beauty of it. Her mind was still replaying the moment she refused a king in front of his entire court. She sat by the window, watching the trees sway outside, when a soft knock came at the door. Before she could answer, it opened, and Callum stepped inside, closing it quietly behind him. "That was either very brave or very foolish," he said, studying her with open curiosity. "Maybe both," Lila replied, not bothering to stand. Callum walked closer, his sharp eyes taking in every detail of her posture, her expression, the way her hands were folded tightly in her lap despite her calm voice. "No one refuses him," he said, "not because they are forced to obey, but because no one has ever wanted to try." "Then perhaps no one has been in my position before," Lila said. "And what position is that?" Callum asked, leaning against the stone wall near the door. "Someone who does not want a crown," she said simply. "Someone who only wants to go home." Callum was quiet for a moment, studying her as though recalculating something in his mind. "The king does not take rejection well," he finally said. "Not because his pride is wounded, though it certainly is, but because no one has ever denied him anything in his entire life. You may have just changed something in this castle that cannot easily be undone." "I did not do it to change anything," Lila said. "I did it because it was the truth." Callum studied her a moment longer, then nodded slowly, almost to himself, before turning toward the door. "Rest while you can," he said. "Tomorrow, he will try again. He always tries again." After Callum left, Lila lay awake long into the night, staring at the ceiling, wondering what kind of world she had stepped into, and whether refusing a king once would be the only time she would need to be brave, or only the beginning of something far larger than she understood. Morning came too quickly. A servant arrived before sunrise with new clothes, fine fabric dyed the deep green of the royal house, and instructions that Lila was expected in the private council chamber within the hour. She dressed slowly, trying to steady her nerves, aware that whatever came next would not be as simple as walking away. The council chamber was smaller than the Great Hall, but somehow more intimidating, with dark wood walls and a long table surrounded by advisors who studied maps and reports with quiet urgency. Damien sat at the head of the table, his expression unreadable, his eyes lifting the moment Lila entered. "Leave us," he said to the advisors, and one by one, they filed out until only Callum remained standing near the door, silent and watchful. "You surprised me yesterday," Damien said once the room had emptied. "I was not trying to surprise anyone," Lila answered. "No," he agreed. "I do not think you were." He rose from his seat and walked slowly around the table, studying her the way a man studies something he cannot quite categorize. "I offered you wealth, status, safety for the pack you clearly care for, since I have already read the reports on your village. And still you refused. Wealth and status were never what I wanted," Lila said. "You assumed they were because that is what every other choice has offered you, but I am not every other choice." Something flickered behind Damien's eyes, something close to frustration, though not entirely unkind. "Then tell me what you want," he said, "and perhaps I can offer it instead." Lila met his gaze without flinching. "I want the freedom to decide my own life. Not to be summoned, not to be measured, not to be given a crown, as though it were a gift I should be grateful for." The room fell silent. Even Callum, standing near the door, seemed to hold his breath. "You refuse me again," Damien said quietly. "I do," Lila answered. For the second time in less than a day, Lila Bennett had rejected the Alpha King, and this time, the words seemed to hang in the air far longer than before, as though the castle itself was struggling to understand what had just happened within its walls. Damien did not respond with anger, though everyone in the room seemed to expect it. Instead, he studied her for a long, quiet moment, then turned and walked back toward the window, staring out at the forest beyond the castle walls. "Leave her be for now," he said finally, not looking back. but she does not leave the castle grounds. Lila opened her mouth to protest, but Callum stepped forward gently, guiding her toward the door before she could say another word that might make things worse. Once they were outside the chamber, he exhaled slowly, as though he too had been holding his breath the entire time. 2 rejections in one day, he murmured, almost to himself. I did not think I would live to see it. Is that meant to be a compliment? Lila asked. It is meant to be a warning, Callum said, because a man like him does not simply let go of something he cannot understand. And right now, you are the only thing in this castle he does not understand. Lila said nothing, but as she walked back toward her quarters, she could not shake the feeling that whatever she had started in that hall was only the beginning of something neither she, nor the king, nor anyone watching from the shadows, could yet predict. 3 days passed before Damien summoned Lila again, and in that time, the castle had transformed around her. Servants who once refused to meet her eyes now watched her from doorways with open curiosity. Guards who had escorted her like a prisoner now stood a little straighter when she passed, unsure of how to treat a woman who had twice refused their king and still walked free. Lila spent those days wandering the gardens behind the guest wing, the only place in the castle that felt untouched by politics or fear. Tall hedges lined narrow stone paths, and a small pond reflected the gray winter sky. It reminded her faintly of home, though nothing here truly compared to the simple wooden house where she had spent her life healing cuts and fevers rather than navigating thrones. On the 3rd evening, Callum found her there, sitting on a stone bench near the water, her knees pulled up against the cold. You are not afraid of him, Callum said, settling onto the opposite end of the bench without asking permission. Everyone else in this castle is. I am afraid, Lila admitted. I am simply more afraid of losing myself than I am of him. Callum considered this for a long moment, watching the ripples move across the pond. Do you know what happens to most candidates who come here? He asked. They arrive terrified, and within a week, they either leave broken-hearted, or they change completely, molding themselves into whatever shape they believe will please him. You have done neither. Should I be proud of that? Lila asked. I think you should be careful, Callum said, because he is not used to being denied, and men who are used to getting everything they want often do not know how to process the one thing they cannot have. Before Lila could respond, the sound of footsteps on gravel interrupted them, and both turned to see Damien himself approaching, his cloak pulled tight against the evening chill. Callum rose immediately, bowing his head slightly, before stepping back to allow his king room to speak. Leave us, Damien said, and Callum obeyed, though his eyes lingered on Lila for a moment longer than necessary before he walked away. Damien did not sit. He stood near the edge of the pond, staring down at his own reflection, as though searching for an answer he could not quite find. I have never had to ask anyone twice for anything, he said finally. Not since I became king. Not since before that, if I am honest. I imagine that must be strange for you, Lila said carefully. Being told no. It is more than strange, he admitted. It is unsettling. He turned to face her fully, his pale eyes catching the last light of the setting sun. I do not understand why you would refuse everything I am offering. Power, protection, a future far beyond anything your village could provide. Because you are offering me a life built entirely around what you want, Lila said. Not what I want. You have never once asked what I dream of, what I fear, what matters to me, beyond usefulness to your kingdom. Damien was quiet for a long moment, his jaw tightening slightly, as though the question had struck somewhere he had not expected. Then tell me, he said finally. What do you dream of? Lila hesitated, surprised by the sincerity in his voice. I dream of a life where I am not measured by what I can offer someone else, she said, where I am allowed to simply exist without being judged for a crown I never asked for. For the first time since she had arrived, something in Damien's expression softened, just slightly, just enough for Lila to notice. That is a strange thing to want from a king, he said quietly. Perhaps, Lila answered, but it is the truth. He studied her a moment longer, then turned and walked away, without another word, leaving Lila alone by the pond once more, uncertain whether she had just made things better or infinitely more complicated. The following morning, Lila was summoned once more, this time not to the council chamber, but to the private study, where Damien conducted matters too sensitive for court ears. The room was lined with old books and maps, a fire crackling softly in the corner, and Damien sat behind a heavy wooden desk, studying a letter with a furrowed brow. "Sit," he said, gesturing to the chair across from him, though his eyes remained on the parchment. Lila sat cautiously, unsure what this meeting would bring. After a long moment, Damien set the letter aside and looked at her directly. "I have decided to offer you one final choice," he said, "not as a candidate, not as property, as a woman, being given an honest question, for the first time since you arrived." Lila straightened slightly, surprised by the shift in his tone. "I am listening," she said. "Stay in this castle," Damien said. "Not as my mate, not yet. But as an advisor to the healers, as someone whose skills are valuable, regardless of what happens between us. No expectations, no demands. Simply a place, if you want it." Lila studied him carefully, searching for the trap she assumed must be hidden somewhere in the offer. "And if I still say no?" she asked. "Then you say no," Damien answered simply, "and I will arrange for your safe return home, along with protection for your village, regardless of your answer." The offer hung in the air between them, stripped of the pressure and spectacle of the great hall, stripped of crowns and thrones and court politics. For the first time, Lila saw not a king demanding obedience, but a man attempting, however clumsily, to understand her. "I need time to think," she said honestly. "Take it," Damien replied. "I am not asking for an answer today." As Lila rose to leave, she paused at the door, glancing back at him one final time. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for finally asking instead of demanding." Damien said nothing, but as the door closed behind her, he remained seated at his desk for a long time, staring at the empty space where she had been standing, wondering why a single healer from a minor pack had managed to unsettle him more deeply than any threat, any rival, any war he had faced in his entire reign. That night, word of the private meeting spread through the castle, exactly as every rumor before it had, twisting and growing with each retelling, until servants whispered that the king had proposed marriage outright, and nobles whispered that the healer girl had demanded an entire province in exchange for her hand. Lila heard none of these rumors directly, but she felt their weight in the way people watched her now, no longer simply curious, but calculating, wondering what her presence might mean for the balance of power within the kingdom. Callum found her again near the gardens the following evening, his expression more serious than before. "You should know," he said, "that not everyone in this castle is pleased with the attention you have received. There are those who believe a king's mate should come from noble blood, not from a healer's cottage in the countryside." "I never asked to be his mate," Lila reminded him. "I know," Callum said, "but perception matters more than truth in places like this, and there are those who may see you as a threat to plans they have been building for years." Lila felt a chill run through her that had nothing to do with the cold evening air. "What kind of plans?" she asked. Callum hesitated, glancing around as though ensuring they were truly alone. "I cannot say for certain," he admitted, "but I would advise caution. Trust carefully. Not everyone smiling at you within these walls wishes you well." Lila nodded slowly, absorbing the warning, aware that whatever simple life she had imagined returning to, now felt further away than ever, tangled instead in a web of court politics she barely understood. As she walked back toward her quarters that night, she could not shake the feeling that her 3 refusals, rather than freeing her from this place, had somehow bound her more tightly to its fate, and to the fate of the man who ruled it. Lila did not sleep well that night, her mind circling the offer Damien had made, turning it over from every angle, searching for the catch she was certain must exist somewhere beneath its simplicity. By morning, she had reached a decision, though it was not the one anyone in the castle expected. She requested an audience with the king directly, and within the hour, she stood once more in his private study, watching him rise from behind his desk as she entered. "You have an answer," he said, reading her expression before she spoke a single word. "I do," Lila said. "And it is no." The word landed differently this time, quieter, without the audience of the great hall, without the shock of the council chamber. This was simply 2 people in a room, one giving an honest answer, the other absorbing it fully for the first time. "Even the offer of staying without expectation," Damien said slowly. "Even that, you refuse." "Because even without expectation stated aloud, the expectation would always exist," Lila said. Every glance, every whisper, every moment I remained within these walls would carry the question of whether I might one day become your mate. I cannot build a life inside that question. I need to return home, to the people who need my skills, to the life I actually chose for myself. Damien studied her for a long silent moment, and this time, there was no anger in his eyes, no wounded pride, only a strange, quiet respect that seemed to surprise even himself. 3 times, he said softly, almost to himself. No one has refused me once. In all my years as king, you have refused me 3 times, and each time, you have done it with more honesty than the last. I did not do it to prove anything, Lila said. I did it because it was true. Damien nodded slowly, then walked to the window, staring out at the training grounds below, where warriors moved through drills beneath the pale morning sun. I will arrange your escort home within the week, he said finally, and protection for your village will remain, regardless of anything that has happened between us. Lila felt a strange mixture of relief, and something else she could not quite name, something close to disappointment, though she pushed the feeling aside before it could take root. Thank you, she said simply, and turned to leave. Outside the study, Callum waited near the corridor, his expression unreadable as she approached. He had clearly been listening, or perhaps simply sensed the outcome from the tension in the air. 3 times, he murmured as she passed, shaking his head slightly, a note of disbelief still lingering in his voice. No one has ever done that. Lila paused, glancing back at him. Is that meant to frighten me? She asked. No, Callum said, his green eyes steady on hers. It is meant to tell you that you have changed something in this castle that cannot easily be undone, whether you intended to or not. Word of the 3rd refusal spread through the castle, faster than either of the first 2, carried on whispered breath from kitchen to courtyard, from guard post to noble chamber. By evening, the entire kingdom seemed to know that the healer girl had refused the Alpha King not once, not twice, but 3 times, and had walked away from his private study with her freedom intact. Some servants spoke of it with awe, calling her the bravest woman to ever step foot in the castle. Others spoke of it with suspicion, wondering what kind of woman could deny a king 3 times and still leave unharmed, unless some hidden power protected her that no one yet understood. Lila heard none of these whispers directly, retreating instead to the garden, where she had found the only peace this castle offered her. She sat by the pond as the sun set, watching the water turn gold, then orange, then a deep and quiet blue, trying to steady the strange unease still sitting in her chest, despite having gotten exactly what she asked for. Footsteps approached from behind, lighter than Damien's heavy stride, and she turned to see Callum walking toward her, his expression softer now than it had been earlier in the corridor. You seem troubled, he observed, settling onto the bench beside her, for someone who just won her freedom. I am troubled because I am not certain what I actually won, Lila admitted. I asked for the freedom to leave, and he granted it without argument. Yet something about that ease unsettles me more than resistance would have. Callum considered this for a long moment, watching the last light fade from the water. Perhaps he granted it because he understood, for the first time, that forcing you to stay would only prove every fear you carried about him, he said. Perhaps letting you go was the only way he knew how to show you that he had heard what you said. Lila studied Callum carefully, noticing the way his voice softened slightly whenever he spoke of Damien's intentions, as though he understood the king in ways few others could. You speak of him with more understanding than most, she said. I have served him since we were young, Callum said. Before the crown, before the weight of an entire kingdom settled onto his shoulders, he was not always so guarded. Something happened to him long ago that taught him never to expect kindness without a price attached. What happened? Lila asked, though she sensed even as she spoke that the question might be one Callum was not free to answer. Callum was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. That is not my story to tell, he said finally. But I will say this. The man you have refused 3 times is not entirely the man everyone believes him to be. There is more beneath the crown than cruelty or pride. Lila absorbed this in silence, watching the darkening garden around them, aware that her time within these walls was drawing to a close, yet feeling, for reasons she could not fully explain, less certain than ever, that leaving was truly the answer she wanted. The days leading up to her departure passed slowly, filled with quiet preparations and stolen moments in the garden that Lila found herself looking forward to more than she wished to admit. Callum visited often, always with some excuse involving castle business, though Lila suspected the truth ran deeper than either of them spoke aloud. Damien, by contrast, kept his distance, though Lila often noticed him watching from a window above the training grounds whenever she walked the garden paths below. Neither of them acknowledged these silent observations directly, yet the weight of them lingered in the air between every brief encounter that followed. On the evening before her scheduled departure, Lila found herself once more in the garden, staring at the pond that had become her only refuge within the castle walls. She heard footsteps approaching, heavier this time, and turned to find Damien himself, standing at the edge of the path, his expression unusually uncertain. "I did not expect to find you awake," he said. "I could not sleep," Lila admitted. "Tomorrow feels heavier than I expected it to." Damien walked closer, stopping a respectful distance away, his hands clasped behind his back, in a posture Lila had come to recognize as his attempt at restraint. "I wanted to ask you something before you leave," he said. "Something I have not been honest about, even with myself." Lila waited, watching him carefully, sensing the shift in the air between them. "When you refused me the first time, I was angry," Damien admitted. "The second time I was confused, but the third time, when you walked away with such calm certainty, I realized I was not angry or confused at all. I was afraid." "Afraid of what?" Lila asked softly. "Afraid that you were right," Damien said. "Afraid that everything I have built my life upon, power, control, the assumption that obedience equals loyalty, might be built on foundations far weaker than I believed. You showed me something no one else has ever dared to show me, and I do not yet know what to do with that truth." Lila studied him carefully, surprised by the vulnerability in his voice, so different from the cold command that had greeted her on her very first day within these walls. "What would you like to do with it?" she asked. Damien was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the darkened garden around them. "I would like to understand you," he said finally. "Not as a candidate, not as a conquest, simply as a person whose perspective has shown me something I did not know I needed to see." "And if understanding leads nowhere?" Lila asked. "Then at least I will have tried honestly, for the first time in my life," Damien said. The words settled between them like something fragile and new, neither entirely a promise nor entirely a request, simply an honest offering from a man unused to offering anything without expectation attached. Lila did not answer immediately, aware that whatever she said next might reshape the path she had so carefully chosen only days before. Instead, she simply nodded, allowing the silence of the gardens to hold the moment a little longer, uncertain, yet of what tomorrow might truly bring. Morning arrived gray and quiet, mist curling low across the training grounds as servants loaded the last of Lila's belongings onto a modest carriage waiting near the castle gates. She had expected relief to fill her chest at the sight of it, the promise of home finally within reach, yet instead she felt only a strange, hollow uncertainty she could not name. Callum met her near the gates, his expression carefully composed, though something behind his eyes betrayed a deeper reluctance to see her go. "The escort is ready whenever you are," he said. "Thank you," Lila replied, "for everything you have done these past weeks." Before Callum could respond, a commotion near the outer wall drew their attention, shouts rising from the gatehouse, followed by the sharp blast of a warning horn that echoed across the courtyard. Guards scrambled into formation, and within moments, a rider burst through the gates, his horse lathered with sweat, his face pale with urgency. "Riders approaching from the eastern ridge," the messenger gasped, sliding from his horse. "Bearing the mark of the Thornwood pack, they demand an audience with the king, immediately." Callum's expression darkened instantly. "The Thornwood pack has not sought audience with this castle in over a decade," he said quietly, more to himself than to Lila. "Something is wrong." Within the hour, the great hall filled once more, though this time the atmosphere carried none of the curiosity that had greeted Lila's first arrival. Instead, tension hung thick in the air, as a delegation from the Thornwood pack entered, led by a broad-shouldered man named Edric, whose cold eyes swept the room with calculated arrogance. "King Damien," Edric said, offering the barest nod of respect. "We come with grave concerns regarding the security of your borders." "Speak plainly," Damien said from his throne, his voice carrying the authority Lila remembered from her very first day within these walls. "Our scouts have reported movement along the northern woods," Edric said. Rogue wolves, unaligned with any pack, growing bold enough to cross into territories that have remained peaceful for generations. We believe your kingdom's weakened alliances have invited this danger. Whispers rippled through the court at the implication, and Damien's jaw tightened visibly. My alliances remain as strong as ever, he said firmly. Do they? Edric asked, his gaze sliding deliberately toward Lila, standing near the edge of the hall beside Callum. Or has your attention been divided by matters better suited to a healer's cottage than a king's court? The insult hung heavy in the air, and Lila felt her cheeks flush with anger rather than embarrassment, refusing to lower her gaze beneath Edric's pointed stare. Choose your words carefully, Damien said, rising slowly from his throne, his presence filling the hall with a warning that needed no further explanation. Edric raised his hands slightly in mock surrender, though the smile lingering on his lips carried no true apology. I mean no disrespect, my king, only concern for a kingdom that has protected these lands for generations. The audience ended tensely, with vague promises of increased patrols and future discussions, though the unease it left behind lingered far longer than the meeting itself. As the hall emptied, Callum guided Lila toward a quieter corridor, his expression grave. That was not simply concern for border security, he said once they were alone. Edric has long resented Damien's refusal to align formally with the Thornwood pack through marriage. Your presence here has clearly reignited old tensions he had hoped to exploit differently. What does that mean for me? Lila asked, a chill settling over her despite the warmth of the corridor. It means you may have become more valuable to certain factions than you realize, Callum said. Not because of who you are, but because of what your connection to Damien might represent to those seeking to destabilize this kingdom. Lila absorbed this warning in silence, aware that her planned departure home suddenly felt far more complicated than a simple carriage ride across quiet countryside. That evening, Damien summoned both Lila and Callum to his private study, his expression heavier than Lila had seen it since her very first day in the castle. Maps of the surrounding territories covered his desk, marked with notations detailing recent troop movements along the northern border. I do not believe Edric's concerns are entirely fabricated, Damien said without preamble. Rogue activity has genuinely increased in recent weeks, but I also do not believe his timing is coincidental. You believe he intends to use the unrest to pressure you into an alliance, Callum said, more statement than question. I believe he intends to use anything available to secure power he has wanted for years, Damien replied, and unfortunately, that now includes information regarding Lila's presence within these walls. Lila felt a knot tighten in her stomach. Are you suggesting I am in danger? She asked directly. Damien met her gaze steadily. I am suggesting that delaying your departure by even a few days could be safer than sending you out onto roads that may no longer be as peaceful as they once were, he said. Not as a demand, as a warning, offered honestly, for your own safety. Lila studied him carefully, searching for manipulation in his words, and finding none, only genuine concern, layered beneath careful restraint. How long would you suggest I stay? She asked. Until the northern patrols confirm the roads are secure, Damien said. A matter of days, not weeks. Reluctantly, Lila agreed, aware that whatever quiet resolution she had hoped to reach with her departure now stood delayed by forces far larger than her own personal choices. Over the following days, the castle grew tense with preparation. Warriors dispatched to reinforce the northern borders, messengers riding in and out at all hours carrying reports that grew increasingly troubling. Lila found herself drawn more frequently into quiet conversations with Damien, no longer as a candidate being evaluated, but as someone whose perspective he seemed genuinely interested in hearing, particularly regarding the well-being of villages caught between larger political conflicts. One evening, as reports of increased rogue activity continued to arrive, Damien found Lila in the garden once more, the pond reflecting a sky heavy with storm clouds. I wanted to thank you, he said, settling onto the bench beside her, closer than he had ever sat before. For what? Lila asked. For reminding me that decisions affecting entire villages should never be made without considering the people actually living within them, Damien said. I have spent years making choices based on strategy and strength. You have shown me the value of considering compassion alongside strength, rather than instead of it. Lila studied him carefully, noticing the sincerity in his voice, so different from the commanding tone that had greeted her on her very first day. That does not sound like the king everyone in this castle fears, she said gently. Perhaps that king was never entirely true to begin with, Damien admitted. Perhaps he was simply the version of myself I believed the crown required. The confession hung between them, quiet and unguarded, and for a moment, Lila found herself seeing not a king demanding obedience, but a man slowly allowing himself to be seen honestly, perhaps for the first time in years. Before either could speak further, a horn sounded from the northern watchtower, sharp and urgent, cutting through the quiet evening air. Damien rose instantly, his expression hardening back into the commanding presence Lila remembered from the great hall. "Stay here," he said. "I need to see what has happened." But as shouts rose from the courtyard and warriors rushed toward the gates, Lila felt certain that whatever peace she had found within this garden was about to be tested in ways she could not yet fully predict. The courtyard had become a storm of movement by the time Lila reached its edge, warriors mounting horses, torches casting long shadows against the castle walls, voices overlapping in urgent reports that made little sense to her untrained ears. Callum found her quickly, pulling her gently back from the chaos toward the safety of the corridor. "What has happened?" Lila asked, breathless from the sudden commotion. "A village along the northern border has been attacked," Callum said grimly. "Rogue wolves, according to the scouts, though the pattern of the attack suggests more coordination than rogues typically display." "Is anyone hurt?" Lila asked immediately, her healer's instincts overriding her fear. "Several villagers, yes," Callum confirmed. "Damien is preparing to ride out with a small force to assess the damage and secure the area." Without hesitation, Lila turned toward the healer's wing, gathering supplies with practiced efficiency. Callum watched her for a moment, understanding immediately what she intended. "You wish to go with them," he said. "Injured people need care," Lila said simply. "I have skills that could help." Callum hesitated only briefly before nodding. "I will speak with Damien, but stay close to me once we arrive. This situation is far from resolved." The ride north was tense and swift, the castle disappearing behind them, as the group moved through darkened forest paths, lit only by torchlight and the pale glow of a clouded moon. Lila had never ridden so far so quickly, her body aching from the unfamiliar pace, yet her mind remained focused entirely on the injured villagers waiting ahead. They arrived to a scene of quiet devastation, several homes damaged, villagers gathered in frightened clusters, tending to wounds as best they could without proper supplies. Lila moved immediately among them, assessing injuries with calm efficiency, directing Callum and several warriors to assist with bandages and makeshift splints. Damien, meanwhile, moved through the wreckage with quiet intensity, questioning villagers about what they had witnessed, his expression darkening further with each account he gathered. "This was not a rogue attack," he said finally, approaching Callum and Lila once the worst of the immediate wounds had been treated. "Witnesses describe organized movement, deliberate targeting of grain stores and water sources. This was designed to create panic, not simply to cause harm." "Edric," Callum said quietly, though his tone made clear it was not truly a question. "I cannot prove it yet," Damien said, "but the timing aligns too precisely with his visit to the castle to be coincidence." Lila, still kneeling beside an elderly villager whose arm she had just finished bandaging, looked up sharply. "He would risk innocent lives simply to pressure you into an alliance?" she asked, disbelief coloring her voice. "Men hungry for power rarely consider the cost paid by those without it," Damien said grimly. As the group prepared to return to the castle before dawn, a young scout arrived breathlessly, delivering a message that made Damien's expression harden into something far colder than Lila had yet witnessed. "What is it?" Callum asked immediately. "A message left at the village outskirts," the scout said, handing over a folded parchment. "Addressed directly to the king." Damien read the message in silence, his jaw tightening with each line. When he finally looked up, his eyes found Lila directly. "Edric claims responsibility for tonight's attack," he said quietly, "and he states that further villages will suffer the same fate unless I agree to a formal alliance through marriage, sealed within the fortnight." The words landed heavily in the cold night air. Lila felt her stomach tighten with dawning realization. "He is using innocent lives as leverage," she said, horror creeping into her voice. "Yes," Damien said grimly, "and he has made clear that his intended alliance involves not simply a political marriage, but the removal of any obstacle currently standing in its way." Callum's expression shifted instantly, understanding dawning alongside Lila's own growing fear. "He means you," he said, turning toward Lila. "He considers your presence a threat to his plans." Damien's hand tightened around the parchment, crumpling it slightly in his grip. "I will not allow harm to come to her," he said firmly, "nor to another single village within these borders." "What will you do?" Lila asked. "I will not agree to his terms," Damien said, "but I also will not allow him to continue attacking innocent people while I search for another solution. We return to the castle immediately. I need to gather my full council and determine our next move before he strikes again." The ride back to the castle passed in tense silence, each member of the group lost in their own thoughts regarding the danger now clearly surrounding them. Lila rode close beside Callum, her mind racing through the implications of what she had just learned, aware that her presence within these walls had somehow become entangled in a conflict far larger than she had ever anticipated. Once back within the safety of the castle, Damien convened his full council late into the night, debating strategies for both defending the northern villages and addressing Edric's dangerous demands. Lila was not invited into these discussions, though Callum kept her informed of developments whenever he could slip away. "They believe increasing patrols along the border may deter further attacks," Callum told her during one such visit, finding her in the healer's wing tending to a young warrior, injured during the earlier assault. "But no one has yet determined how to address Edric's ultimatum directly. He wants Damien to marry into his pack," Lila said quietly, "or he will continue hurting innocent people." "Yes," Callum confirmed, "and unfortunately, several council members believe agreeing to some form of alliance may be the only way to prevent further bloodshed." Lila felt a strange tightness in her chest at the thought, though she quickly reminded herself that whatever happened between Damien and political alliances was no longer truly her concern, regardless of the quiet moments they had shared in the garden. "That is his decision to make," she said carefully, "for the safety of his people." Callum studied her closely, something unspoken passing behind his eyes. "Is that truly how you feel?" he asked quietly. "Or is that simply what you believe you should feel?" Lila did not answer immediately, aware that the question touched something she had not yet allowed herself to examine honestly. Before she could respond, urgent voices echoed from the corridor outside, followed by hurried footsteps approaching the healer's wing. A guard appeared in the doorway, his expression tight with alarm. "Beta Callum," he said urgently. "You are needed immediately. There has been an incident within the castle grounds." Callum rose instantly, exchanging a worried glance with Lila before following the guard from the room, leaving Lila alone with a growing sense of dread she could not fully explain, though something deep within her sensed that whatever had happened within the castle walls tonight would change everything that followed. Lila did not remain alone for long. Within moments, another guard appeared at the healer's wing entrance, his face pale beneath the torchlight. "You need to come as well," he said urgently. "Beta Callum requested your presence directly." Confused and increasingly uneasy, Lila followed the guard through winding corridors toward the castle's outer garden, the same peaceful space where she had spent so many quiet evenings since her arrival. Now, however, the garden was filled with warriors, torches casting harsh light across the once tranquil pond, and at its center stood Callum, kneeling beside a fallen guard, whose uniform bore unfamiliar markings. "What happened here?" Lila asked, rushing forward with healer instincts overriding her fear. "An intruder," Callum said grimly, rising to meet her, "disguised as one of our own guards. He was discovered attempting to access the guest wing where you have been staying." Lila felt a cold chill run through her entire body. "He was looking for me," she said quietly, the realization settling heavily in her chest. "We believe so," Callum confirmed. "Fortunately, one of our patrols recognized the discrepancy in his uniform before he could reach your quarters." "Is he alive?" Lila asked, glancing toward the fallen figure on the ground. "Wounded, but alive," Callum said. "Damien is questioning him now within the lower chambers." Before Lila could respond further, Damien himself emerged from the shadows near the garden entrance, his expression darker and more furious than Lila had ever witnessed. "He has confirmed what we suspected," Damien said, his voice tight with restrained anger. "Edric sent him specifically to capture you, intending to use you as additional leverage beyond his current demands." The words landed like a physical blow. Lila felt her legs weaken slightly, though she forced herself to remain steady, refusing to let fear overtake her completely. Why would he need additional leverage, she asked, if he already threatens entire villages? Because he suspects, correctly, that your presence has come to mean something to me beyond simple curiosity, Damien said, his eyes meeting hers directly, unguarded for the first time in front of others watching nearby. And he intends to exploit that connection in whatever way proves most effective. Callum shifted uncomfortably nearby, clearly recognizing the significance of Damien's admission spoken so openly. Lila, however, felt something steady settle within her chest, despite the danger surrounding them, a quiet clarity she had not expected to find amid such chaos. Then we do not let him succeed, she said firmly. Damien studied her for a long moment, something like admiration flickering behind the anger still evident in his eyes. I will not allow you to be used as a pawn in his schemes, he said. Increased guards will be posted around your quarters immediately, and you will not leave the inner castle grounds until this threat has been fully resolved. And the village is still at risk? Lila asked. I have already dispatched additional forces to reinforce the northern border, Damien said. But Edric's true target has shifted tonight from territorial pressure to something far more personal, which means our response must adapt accordingly. Over the following days, the castle transformed into something resembling a fortress under quiet siege. Additional guards posted at every entrance, patrols doubled along every corridor, and a tension settling over every interaction that had not existed even during Lila's earliest, most uncertain days within these walls. Despite the danger, or perhaps because of it, Lila found herself spending increasing time in Damien's company, no longer separated by the formal distance of court ceremony, but drawn together by the shared urgency of navigating a threat neither could fully control alone. Callum, too, remained close, his quiet loyalty evident in every careful precaution he arranged, every watchful glance he cast toward Lila whenever she moved through the castle grounds. One evening, as reports arrived confirming that Edric's forces had begun massing near the northern border despite ongoing negotiations, Damien found Lila once more in the garden, though this time, guards stood watchful at every entrance rather than allowing the space its usual quiet privacy. I owe you an apology, Damien said, settling onto the bench beside her. For what? Lila asked. For allowing my own ambitions and assumptions to place you in danger you never asked to be part of, Damien said. Had I handled your arrival differently from the very beginning, perhaps none of this would have unfolded as it has. You cannot control the ambitions of men like Edric, Lila said gently, regardless of how you handled my arrival. Perhaps not, Damien admitted. But I can control how I choose to protect what matters to me now, regardless of the cost. Lila studied him carefully, aware of the deeper meaning layered beneath his words. What matters to you now? She asked quietly. Damien met her gaze directly, something raw and unguarded passing across his expression. You, he said simply. Not as a candidate, not as a political solution, simply you, exactly as you are, refusals and all. The confession settled between them like something fragile and precious, and for a moment, Lila allowed herself to feel the full weight of what had grown between them, since her very first, defiant refusal within the great hall. Before either could speak further, a sharp shout echoed from the castle wall, followed by the urgent blast of a warning horn that shattered the quiet moment entirely. Guards rushed past the garden entrance, and Callum appeared moments later, his expression grave. Edric's forces are approaching the castle directly, he said urgently. He has abandoned negotiations entirely. This is no longer a threat contained to the northern villages. Damien rose instantly, his expression hardening back into the commanding presence Lila had witnessed on her very first day within these walls, though now tempered by something fiercer, more protective than simple authority alone. Prepare the defenses, he said firmly, and ensure Lila remains within the innermost chambers, guarded at all times. I want to help, Lila said immediately. Wounded warriors will need care, regardless of how this battle unfolds. Damien hesitated only briefly before nodding. Stay within the healer's wing, he said. Callum will ensure your safety throughout. As warriors scrambled into formation across the castle grounds, torches blazing against the darkening sky, Lila felt a strange, steady resolve settle over her fear. Whatever unfolded in the hours ahead, she was determined to face it not as a helpless bystander, but as someone capable of making a genuine difference for the people now depending on her skills and her courage in equal measure. The healer's wing filled quickly with the sounds of distant shouting and clashing steel, as Edric's forces pressed against the castle's outer defenses. Lila worked alongside two older healers, preparing bandages, herbs, and clean water, her hands steady despite the fear tightening her chest with every distant crash, echoing through the stone walls. Callum remained close, positioned near the entrance with a small group of guards, though his eyes frequently drifted toward Lila, checking her safety, even amid the chaos unfolding outside. "The outer wall is holding," he reported after receiving word from a passing messenger. "Damien is leading the defense personally, along the eastern gate, where Edric has concentrated the bulk of his forces." "Is he safe?" Lila asked immediately, unable to fully mask the concern in her voice. "He is skilled and experienced," Callum said carefully. "But Edric has brought more warriors than our scouts initially estimated. This will not be a quick battle." As the night wore on, wounded warriors began arriving in growing numbers, and Lila threw herself fully into her work, treating cuts, setting broken bones, and calming frightened young fighters who had never faced true combat before this night. The work steadied her nerves in a way idle waiting never could, giving her fear a purpose rather than allowing it to consume her entirely. Hours passed in a blur of urgent care and hushed reports from the battlefield, until finally, near dawn, a messenger arrived with news that made the entire healer's wing fall momentarily silent. "The eastern gate has been breached," the messenger gasped. "Edric's forces have pushed through into the outer courtyard." Callum's expression hardened instantly. "Where is Damien?" he demanded. "Still fighting," the messenger said, "but he has been separated from the main defensive line. Several warriors are searching for him now." Without hesitation, Callum turned toward the door, gathering the guards remaining in the healer's wing. "Stay here," he told Lila firmly. "Barricade the entrance the moment we leave." "I am coming with you," Lila said immediately, gathering her healing supplies without waiting for permission. "It is too dangerous," Callum argued. "If Damien is wounded, he will need care immediately," Lila said firmly. "I am not staying behind while he bleeds somewhere in that courtyard." Callum studied her for a brief moment, recognizing the same unshakable resolve that had first caught his attention on her very first day within the castle walls. "Stay close to me," he said finally, "no matter what happens." The courtyard beyond the healer's wing had become a scene of true chaos, warriors clashing in the flickering torchlight, shouts and cries echoing off the ancient stone walls. Callum moved swiftly through the fighting, guiding Lila carefully toward the eastern section where Damien had last been seen, cutting down any threat that crossed their path with practiced, efficient precision. They found him near a collapsed section of the outer wall, fighting against 3 of Edric's warriors simultaneously, blood staining his sleeve from a deep gash along his forearm, though his movements remained sharp and controlled despite the injury. Callum joined the fight immediately, evening the odds enough for Damien to finish off the remaining attackers within moments. As the immediate threat cleared, Damien turned, his eyes widening with alarm the moment he spotted Lila standing nearby. "You should not be here," he said urgently, though the relief evident beneath his alarm betrayed how deeply her safety mattered to him. "You are injured," Lila said, already moving toward him, her healer instincts overriding any argument he might offer. "Let me help." Before Damien could respond, a shout rose from across the courtyard, and Edric himself emerged from the chaos, flanked by several remaining warriors, his expression twisted with fury at the sight of his plans crumbling around him. "This ends now," Edric snarled, drawing his weapon and advancing directly toward the small group. Damien stepped forward instantly, positioning himself between Edric and Lila despite the wound still bleeding along his arm. "Your forces are broken, Edric," he said firmly. "Surrender now, and I will consider mercy for those who followed you unwillingly into this conflict." "Mercy," Edric spat, "from a king who allowed a healer to distract him from his true duties." "She has taught me more about true duty than you have ever understood," Damien said, his voice carrying steady authority despite the chaos surrounding them. "Duty is not simply strength. It is protecting those who cannot protect themselves, regardless of personal cost." Edric lunged forward with sudden, desperate aggression, but Damien met the attack with practiced skill, his wounded arm slowing him only slightly as he disarmed his opponent within moments, forcing him to his knees before the gathering crowd of warriors now watching the confrontation unfold. "It is finished," Damien said firmly, his voice carrying across the courtyard, as remaining guards moved to secure Edric and his defeated forces. Take him to the lower chambers. His fate will be decided once order has been fully restored. As guards led Edric away, Damien turned finally toward Lila, his expression softening despite the exhaustion evident across his features. "You should not have come here," he repeated, though his voice held no true reprimand. "And you should not have faced 3 warriors alone while bleeding," Lila countered, already examining his wounded arm with careful, practiced hands. Callum, standing nearby, allowed himself a small, tired smile at the exchange, recognizing the deeper affection woven through their words, despite the surrounding chaos. "The battle is over," he said quietly. "Let us return inside before either of you collapses from exhaustion." As dawn broke fully over the castle, casting golden light across a courtyard scarred by the night's conflict, Lila walked beside Damien, back toward the safety of the inner walls, aware that whatever uncertain future awaited them now, it would be built upon something far stronger than politics or obligation alone. In the weeks that followed the battle, the castle slowly returned to a fragile sense of order. Edric's forces were disbanded and sent home under strict new terms, drawn up by Damien's council, while Edric himself remained confined within the lower chambers, awaiting judgment that would be decided once the full extent of his actions had been properly investigated. The northern villages received support and supplies to rebuild what had been damaged, and patrols along the border settled into a calmer, steadier rhythm than they had known in months. Lila spent those weeks primarily within the healer's wing, tending to the lingering wounds of warriors injured during the conflict, including Damien's own arm, which healed steadily under her careful attention. Their conversations during these quiet sessions grew longer, more open, stripped gradually of the formality that had once defined every interaction between them. "You never did answer my question," Damien said one afternoon, as Lila carefully changed the bandage along his forearm. "Whether you feel differently now than you did on the day you gave your 3rd refusal." Lila paused, considering her words carefully. "I feel many things differently now," she admitted. "I have seen a version of you that court ceremony never revealed. A man willing to bleed defending people he barely knew, willing to admit fear and uncertainty rather than hiding behind command alone." "And does that change your answer?" Damien asked quietly. "It changes my understanding," Lila said, "though I still believe firmly that any answer I give must come from genuine choice, not obligation born from gratitude or circumstance." Damien nodded slowly, accepting her words without argument, a patience Lila had not witnessed in him during their very first meeting within the Great Hall. "Then I will wait," he said simply, "for as long as genuine choice requires." Meanwhile, Callum found himself navigating a quieter, more complicated tangle of emotions. Watching Lila and Damien grow closer during those weeks stirred feelings he had not expected, feelings he recognized clearly now as more than simple loyalty or admiration. Yet he remained careful never to interfere, understanding deeply that whatever grew between Lila and his king deserved space to develop honestly, without added complication from his own quiet affections. One evening, Lila found Callum alone in the garden, staring silently at the pond that had witnessed so many pivotal moments since her arrival. "You seem troubled," she said gently, settling onto the familiar bench beside him. "I am simply thinking," Callum said, offering a small, tired smile, "about choices, and timing, and the strange ways life arranges things beyond our control." Lila studied him carefully, sensing deeper meaning beneath his words. "Callum," she said softly, "you have been a true friend to me since the very beginning, when I understood nothing about this castle or the dangers surrounding it. I will never forget that kindness." "Friendship was never difficult to offer you," Callum said quietly. "You made it remarkably easy, from the very first refusal you gave within that hall." Something unspoken passed between them, gentle and bittersweet, an acknowledgement of feelings that would remain forever, gently unspoken, quietly set aside, in favor of the deeper bond already forming between Lila and the king he served so faithfully. "Whatever you decide," Callum said finally, rising from the bench, "know that this castle, and everyone within it, is genuinely better for having known you." As autumn settled fully over the kingdom, painting the surrounding forest in deep shades of gold and crimson, Damien called Lila once more to his private study, though this time, no maps or urgent reports covered his desk. Only a single, simple request, waiting quietly between them. "I am not asking you to be my mate," Damien said carefully, once Lila had settled into the chair across from him. "Not today. I am asking whether you would consider remaining within this kingdom, in whatever capacity feels true to you, healer, advisor, or simply a woman choosing her own path within walls that have come to value her honesty above all else." Lila studied him carefully, recognizing the significant shift from his very first demand that she kneel before him on the day of her arrival. "No expectations," she said slowly. "Beyond simply staying?" "None," Damien confirmed. "Though I will admit honestly that I hope, in time, genuine choice might lead you toward remaining by my side more permanently. But that hope changes nothing about the offer itself. It stands regardless of your answer." Lila considered his words carefully, remembering every refusal she had given since her arrival, every moment of fear and uncertainty, every quiet garden conversation that had gradually reshaped her understanding of the man sitting before her now. She thought of the villages she had helped heal, the warriors whose wounds she had tended, the friendship she had built with Callum, and the strange, unexpected respect that had grown steadily between herself and the king who once demanded her obedience without question. "I will stay," she said finally, her voice steady and certain. "Not because of obligation, and not because of gratitude alone, but because I have found something genuine within these walls, worth choosing freely." Damien's expression softened into something Lila had never witnessed before, relief and quiet joy blending together into an emotion far removed from the cold authority that had greeted her on her very first day. "Thank you," he said simply, "for choosing honestly, exactly as you have from the very beginning." Word spread quickly through the castle that the healer who had once refused the Alpha King 3 times had finally chosen to remain, not through demand or political necessity, but through her own free will, exactly as she had insisted from her very first defiant refusal within the Great Hall. Servants who once whispered in fear now spoke with genuine admiration, and nobles who once doubted her place within these walls slowly began to recognize the quiet strength she had brought to a kingdom in need of exactly that kind of honesty. In the seasons that followed, Lila continued her work among the castle's healers, gradually becoming a trusted voice within council discussions regarding the well-being of villages throughout the kingdom. Her bond with Damien deepened slowly, built not upon crowns or thrones, but upon genuine respect earned through honesty, courage, and the simple willingness to see each other fully, flaws and strengths alike. And though the Great Hall would host many more ceremonies in the years that followed, none would ever quite match the quiet astonishment of that very first day, when a healer from a minor pack refused the Alpha King not once, but 3 times, forever changing the course of a kingdom that had never before known what it meant to be genuinely challenged, and ultimately, genuinely understood.